Let's begin our discussion of the next organ system called the muscular system. When we study the muscular system, we typically cover two slightly different topics. The first one in this PowerPoint is muscle tissue. What we do here is look at muscle cells and their structure, how they are packaged together in a muscle, and then most importantly, the physiology behind muscle contraction. And muscle physiology typically is one of the more difficult topics in A&P 1. It's our first really thorough dive into molecular level of physiology. So we're going to be looking at a lot of muscle proteins and how they work in order to cause muscle contraction. As a quick overview of the muscular system, we typically think of 5 really important functions of our muscles. One is to move the whole body, whether you're walking, picking something up, taking notes, and that's done using skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle, as you recall, is attached to bones. So typically, most skeletal muscles are moving bones. There's a handful of muscles we call facial expression muscles, which still attach to bone, but they move skin. Number 2, movement of blood. That's obviously done using your heart, so that would be a function of your cardiac muscle, which we typically hold off on until we get to A&P 2 and study the heart and how it works. The third type of muscle tissue, if you recall, is smooth muscle. And that muscle is used to move substances within the body, whether it's material moving down your GI tract, the movement of urine from the kidneys to the bladder and then out of the bladder. It also facilitates the movement of air through the respiratory tract. So the smooth muscle of your respiratory tract is going to dilate or constrict your airways. We also have smooth muscle in our blood vessels, which helps regulate blood flow. If we need more blood to go to an organ, the smooth muscle in those arteries are going to relax. Those arteries are going to dilate and get bigger in order to send more blood to that organ. Number 4 mentions to maintain posture, so that is a function of your skeletal muscle. Stabilize joints, that is also a function of your skeletal muscle. And then finally, skeletal muscle generates most of the heat produced within the body. Next thing we're going to do is talk about some of the common properties to all muscle tissue. One is has what we call excitability. Excitability is the ability of a tissue, of a cell, to respond to chemicals from neurons, nerve cells. So we're going to take a close look at the interaction between nerve cells or neurons and skeletal muscle cells. And obviously, in order to contract that skeletal muscle cell, it needs a neuron releasing chemicals we call neurotransmitters in order to stimulate that muscle contraction. So we call that ability excitability. Number 2 is contractility. As you can imagine, this is the ability of muscle cells to contract or shorten in order to generate force on whatever that muscle is attached to. Muscles also have to have extensibility. Extensibility is the ability to stretch without damaging the tissue. So we always think of muscles being able to contract and then relax. They also have to be able to stretch a bit. And this is an extremely important property of skeletal muscle in order to prevent damage to that skeletal muscle when it's contracting fairly rigorously. Number 4 is elasticity. This is the ability then to return to the original shape after being stretched. So now if you think of a typical muscle, it will contract, then relax. It might stretch then, and then go back to its original shape. So those are common properties to all muscle tissues. Next thing we're going to do is look at a brief overview of the 3 muscle types, and then on the next slide there's a more detailed figure talking about the different types of muscle. A lot of this you should remember from our discussion during the histology section, where we learned about different tissues of the body. But if you recall, skeletal muscle is attached to bones, cardiac's in the heart, smooth muscle is in various hollow organs. We often call smooth muscle visceral muscle. Visceral means internal organs. The function of the 3, move bones and skin. So typically, again, we think of skeletal muscle of moving bones, but it'll also move skin. Cardiac muscle pumps blood, and smooth muscle, depending on the organ, regulates whatever is inside the lumen of that organ. It could be food, it could be air, it could be urine, it could be blood in the blood vessels. The appearance. Skeletal muscle cells, if you recall, are long cylindrical cells that are multinucleated and striated. Cardiac muscle cells are typically more branched. They have a single nucleus, they are striated, and the muscle cells are attached at intercalated discs. Smooth muscle, one nucleus, no striations, and that's where they got the name smooth, because it doesn't have these stripes within the muscle cells. And then the control, skeletal muscle is voluntary, the other 2 are involuntary. So that are some properties you should recall from earlier this semester. This is a table that is much more thorough. You might have trouble reading it in your PowerPoint, so I recommend maybe opening your book and perusing this more thorough table summarizing the 3 muscle types. What you should focus primarily on is, again, the microscopic features of the cells, the various shapes of the 3 types. Location we should already be familiar with. Diameter, fiber diameter. Notice we often refer to muscle cells as muscle fibers because they're usually very long and thin. But skeletal muscle cells are typically the largest of the 3 muscle cell types. Connective tissues, they all have certain amounts of connective tissues that kind of package the cells within the muscle. Muscle fiber length, skeletal muscle cells are very large. Some of them are up to 12 inches or a foot long. Contractile proteins organized into sarcomeres. We'll be talking more about that. Sarcoplasmic reticulum is going to be very important for muscle physiology. We'll talk more about that in the future, as well as these transverse tubules. But if you look further down, I would just want to point out nervous control. Notice that skeletal muscle is voluntary. It's controlled by the part of the nervous system called the somatic nervous system. Cardiac muscle is involuntary, and smooth muscle is involuntary, controlled by a system called the autonomic nervous system. But we'll be talking about these properties as we progress through the muscle physiology section. The next video lecture is going to start to look at how we take muscle cells and package them in order to form an entire muscle.